Welcome to Dumpster Diving, where we look at something horrible from the past. Today, family matters. This is a Halloween episode, and it begins with Steve Urkel warning people that it might be too scary for children. Although if parents are okay showing their children a grown man who dresses and sounds like Urkel, they've probably stopped caring. Urkel comes down the stairs to talk to the family, and he's carrying something covered with a sheet. He pulls the sheet back and reveals a ventriloquist dummy that looks just like him. This thing is horrifying, and I can only assume it came from the same nightmare factory that produced the original Urkel. Carl screams, which is an appropriate response. Urkel proceeds to do a terrible job being a ventriloquist, though it does give Jaleel White a break from the hell of having to do Urkel's voice every day. The only one who seems to encourage him is Grandma Estelle. Everyone else calls him out for what a shitty job he did. Urkel goes to his room and sets the dummy down in a chair, then he lays on his bed depressed. Eddie walks in and tells him it looks like a severe storm is coming. Urkel says, "Thank you, Al Roker," which is somehow still a relevant reference, but not anywhere near the hilarious joke the audience makes it seem like. Urkel laments that he's not a good ventriloquist, and Eddie confirms, telling him that You blow chunks. And says that the only doll he wants to sit on his lap can talk on her own. Eddie puts on his coat and goes off in search of a 90s hand job, and Urkel is left alone. He lays down on his bed, and a bolt of lightning shoots through his window and hits the dummy. The dummy starts moving its head, and the audience reaction can only be described as giddy excitement. Of course, this is also a group of people who are excited to go to a taping of Family Matters, so they don't have the highest bar. Urkel looks over at the dummy, and it's gone from the chair. He jumps out of bed and sees it on Eddie's bed. The dummy says hi in Satan's voice, and Urkel screams. Although I don't know why. He's familiar with Satan. I mean, he had to sign that contract with him to keep his show on the air for 9 years. Urkel rushes down the stairs to tell the family that his dummy is alive. They don't believe him, and Carl, Harriet, and Estelle all leave him alone. The dummy then comes to life again and tells Urkel that everything is fine. Urkel decides to go up and lay down, which was Harriet's suggestion. Suddenly, instead of using a puppet for the dummy, they've replaced it with a tiny child dressed like Urkel and wearing an ill-fitting mask. Child Protective Services must have gotten thousands of calls after this episode to report the child's mother. Urkel barricades himself into his bedroom, but the dummy climbs in through the window. They argue about whether or not the dummy can be alive, and the puppet wins, chiefly because he's able to speak. Urkel thinks he's lost his mind and asks the dummy why didn't he speak in front of the Winslows. The dummy says that he doesn't like the Winslows. Then he says,
"The Winslows are in the way, so I'll have to get rid of them."
Considering how much the show shifted from being about the family to being only about Urkel, this just seems like a conversation between the producers that somehow made it into the script. Urkel tells the dummy that he's evil, and the dummy loves it. He tells him to call him Stevel from now on, which is as clever as this show is going to get with the puns. Urkel runs downstairs as Carl sends the two young kids out to trick-or-treat. Urkel tells him that he locked Stevel in a trunk upstairs and not to let him out. Carl blows him off again because Reginald Vell Johnson has given up and is just collecting a paycheck now. We then transition back upstairs where Urkel has put little signs on the trunk that say beware and don't open. The signs look like they were made by my 3-year-old, but they were the best efforts of a dork with an IQ of 196. Stevel's hand breaks through the top, and he undoes the latch. Back downstairs, Eddie looks relaxed and refreshed after his handjob and sits down on the couch to read a magazine. Stevel's head pops out from the chimney, and then he calls out to Eddie. When Eddie looks, the dummy has slid his head back up. Stevel calls Eddie over, and he does what any of us would do if we heard the voice of a demon coming from the fireplace. He walks right over there. Eddie climbs in, and Stevel drags him up, I guess to die? Next, we see the two young boys, I'm not bothering to look up their names, riding away on their bikes. Stevel is chasing them in a car that's supposed to look comical, but actually just looks like one of those smart cars. Star Trek may have predicted the cell phone, but Family Matters nailed the smart car. Urkel goes back to his room and finds Stevel gone. Urkel freaks and Stevel appears behind him. He directs Urkel to look at the Bulls poster over his bed. Urkel does and sees that somehow the dummy has put the two little kids there so that their faces are over Jordan and Rodman. It's weird though because he hasn't killed them. He just somehow expertly spackled them into the wall. So Stevel is both evil and an expert carpenter, which means that the villain in this episode is a contractor. Urkel runs downstairs after hearing that Eddie was stuffed in the chimney and can't find anyone. Stevel assures him that the family is there and tells him to check the cupboard. There's Laura in 3 pieces. She's somehow alive, which seems like a medical miracle, and she yells at Urkel for letting his dummy dismember her. To be fair though, she kind of let the dummy do that herself. At this point we realize that the dummy has the weirdest fetish ever, which is not to kill anyone, but to put living human beings inside of other things. Stevel says that
Laura's a nice girl, but she suffers from low self-esteem.
So we can add horrible puns to his list of fetishes, and now he seems less like a monster and more like my drunk Uncle Gary. Urkel asks where Harriet is, and Stevel points him to a giant jack-in-the-box. Urkel turns the crank, and Harriet's head pops out. It's the worst green screen effect I've ever seen. Urkel shoves the puppet into the refrigerator, but it bores through the back and escapes. Urkel then runs to the living room, where Carl is sitting on the couch apparently unharmed. Urkel tells him that his family is inside various household fixtures, and Carl seems fine with it. It's then revealed that Stevel is sitting behind Carl, controlling him like a puppet. And considering where Stevel is sitting and his hand placement, I think we can assume that Carl never has to have a prostate check ever again. The one family member we don't see is Grandma Estelle. I can only assume that she died from natural causes during this episode, and Stevel didn't have the heart to install her in the light fixtures. Stevel finally reveals his evil plan. He wants to go on the road with Urkel as a ventriloquist act. So he's killing all these people for fame, which seems way too intelligent for this writing staff to be doing social commentary, so I have to assume it's a coincidence. Urkel and Stevel fight, and Urkel violently dismembers the dummy. It doesn't matter though, because the dummy puts himself back together and starts to strangle Urkel to death. The screen goes hazy and Urkel wakes up. The whole thing was a dream, which makes sense because this show was mostly grounded in reality, but it also says some seriously disturbing things about how Urkel feels about the family and about comedy. We end with a depressing making-of featurette. That is the face of a man who is regretting every decision in his life. Thanks for joining us today on Dumpster Diving. You can click the little M to subscribe, come back every Thursday for more dumpster diving, Tuesday for deleted chapters from famous novels. Please like, subscribe, and leave a comment for us. Thank you again for watching. See you next time.